Hi, this is Professor Reidinger Dotterman. Welcome to the tutorial on thesis statements, stating your claim. What is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is simply a sentence, or it can be a group of sentences that states the central argument of your paper. And depending on the length of your paper, it's okay for your thesis statement to be more than one sentence long. For example, if you advance to a point where you wind up doing academic writing and maybe you're writing journal articles or chapters in a book, you're going to have thesis statements that are a paragraph long, and that's absolutely okay. In general, though, the thesis statement is what you intend to prove in your essay, or what you intend to persuade your reader to believe is true. To that end, thesis statements must be contestable. You must be able to imagine that a reasonable person could dispute your claim. So a good thesis statement would not be that the Earth is the third planet from the sun, because that's something that we generally accept to be true. Your thesis statement should be something that a reasonable person could say, well, I understand where you're coming from, but I actually see it in a different way for these 5 reasons. Thesis statements often include a roadmap of what the rest of the paper will cover. In other words, they serve a function not only of stating the argument, but also of previewing the major areas of the argument or the major fields of support for the argument. So it serves the capacity of stating the argument as well as kind of providing an organizational structure for the rest of the paper. For example, when considering X, the most compelling position is Y. This can be understood by exploring A, B, and C. And so if I had a thesis statement like that, I would imagine that the areas of my paper would be A, B, and C. And I think it's really important to remember that a thesis statement isn't something that's abandoned. It doesn't just sort of appear at the beginning of your paper and then you never come back to it. The thesis statement should have an integral relationship with the rest of the essay. It should be something that you're referring back to. You should always be thinking when you're writing a paper, how does this paragraph relate to my thesis? How does it support my thesis? So, while we've been talking about what is a thesis, it's also worth addressing what a thesis is not. A thesis is not your paper's introduction. It's an argument, and arguments occur in a context. You have to set the background for that context. You have to have some sort of orientation to for the reader to what you're talking about. So the introduction of your paper should have that relationship with your thesis statement. It should set the context in which you're making the claim. And then the thesis statement comes after you've already created that context. It's also, again, not a statement of fact. In the first 2 papers for this course, your thesis statement is a claim you're making based on your interpretation of the text. And presumably your peers will interpret the text in a different way and arrive at different theses. So even though you might go through the course ratings and you might think, well, obviously this is the right answer, it's important to think that there really isn't a right answer, but that there's something that is compelling to you and you're forming an opinion about it. And that'll be true or should be true when you get to the research paper in the course as well. You shouldn't be just reporting facts when you get to the research paper. Your research paper is, to some extent, a discursive essay and should be making, again, a claim that could be contested. So, where does the thesis appear? There's not really a right answer because different rhetorical traditions treat information differently and treat writing differently, but there is kind of a matter of hedging your bets. So in U.S. academic writing, usually the thesis statement appears at the beginning of the paper, usually near the end of the first paragraph or the introduction section of your paper. And usually it's reiterated in some fashion in the paper's conclusion. Also in U.S. academic writing, a clearly identifiable thesis is preferred. And these are just sort of cultural cultural differences. This is what is valued in U.S. academic culture generally, that there's a clear thesis and that it's presented at the very beginning. If your writing experience is largely derived from another rhetorical tradition, that might seem like the worst idea ever to you. You might prefer a really subtle thesis. You might prefer a thesis that appears in the middle of the paper, or a thesis that appears at the end, and that's completely understandable. It's just that in U.S. academic writing, usually the thesis at the beginning, a very clear thesis, is what is preferred by most readers. There are variations, even with having the thesis at the beginning. Some papers like to pose a thesis question, so they kind of take the approach that they're going to ask a question and that the paper is a response to that question. So it's kind of like an argument, but it takes on the appearance of being kind of like an invitation to the reader to walk through an answer to the question. And that's certainly an approach that you can take. It's a very reasonable approach. Other papers might use a Rogerian model of argumentation, which we'll talk about later in the semester. And the Rogerian model actually presents the thesis. It's more toward the end of the paper. It's not exactly at the end. So it's not a thesis-seeking paper, but it's also not a paper where you begin with the thesis. So there are some variations. And I guess to that end, you should know your audience's expectation for a thesis. In some disciplines, or even within a discipline, some professors, you're going to have some professors who really just want to see that thesis at the very beginning of the paper as a statement in a really clear way, and they want it that way every time. And I think it's understandable, considering how most of your professors are grading papers. We're grading a lot of them, and we're trying to get through them fairly quickly. So in that context, as you can reasonably imagine, your professors are not wanting to spend lots of time figuring out what your argument is, and they really value those papers that include the thesis at the very beginning. However, that you should know that that is not universally true. You can have some professors who really like those thesis questions, or some professors who think that it's very important for papers to be thesis-seeking instead of thesis-driven. I guess now is a good time to disclose my bias. I am open to a variety of thesis constructions. My personal preference as a writer is for essays to be thesis-driven, to have a thesis that's very clear at the beginning and the paper that follows. However, I don't necessarily impose those same standards on my students. I've seen students make their argument very clearly through the use of a thesis question, or also through sort of building toward the thesis as something that occurs later in the paper, and that can be okay. I will say that those things are usually a little bit tougher to do than having a clear thesis at the beginning. So lastly, you might be wondering, what is a good thesis statement? Okay, so a good thesis statement is easy to identify. Again, most readers don't want to spend time figuring out what your argument is. Now, that doesn't mean that your thesis necessarily has to appear at the beginning of your paper, but by the end of your paper, people should know what your argument is. They shouldn't be wondering, what was it that this person was trying to claim? So however you go about presenting your thesis or constructing your thesis, you need to think about whether or not that argument winds up being really clear. And a good way of judging that is often through peer review or through getting somebody else's reaction to your paper, because generally I think when we write things, we imagine that they're clear to other people. We don't write things and just say, oh, I don't know what this is, but I'm putting it on the paper. We don't do that. But sometimes when people read things we've written, they don't find that they are as clear as they are to us. So that's why peer review is a very important part of the writing process, in my view. Another thing about a good thesis statement is that it's specific. So when you're making a claim, your reader's going to have like this implied, well, how is this true? Or why is this true? And your thesis statement often includes a brief description of the by. In other words, this is going to happen, or this is possible by way of this, or this will occur by way of this, or this is true because of this, or this is persuasive because of this. So those are things that a good thesis statement will address. A good thesis statement shouldn't be really super general. It should be pretty specific to what you wish to argue, and it should anticipate what kinds of questions the reader will have in his or her mind. A good thesis statement, finally, stays within its modality. Your thesis statement is not expected to resolve an issue. It's not expected to be the final word ever that's said on the subject, and it's not supposed to account for all variations. So you should really think about what it is you can prove or you can present as persuasive in your paper, and you should tailor your thesis statement to be specific to that. You should only claim what it is you can support. So it's the difference between saying, X is the best course of action always, X is the best course of action sometimes, X is the best course of action in limited circumstances. It's really important to use your language to be specific about the degree to which your thesis statement is something that people should find true. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to thesis statements. The best thing to do when you're writing a thesis statement is to really get somebody's feedback on that thesis statement. A lot of times, if you are struggling to write a thesis statement, it can help to just put together a draft of the thesis statement and then ask somebody to read it and say back to you what it is that they think that you're going to be proving in that paper, or what they think it is that you're going to be arguing. And that will give you some insight into whether or not the way that you've stated things is on target, and it will also give you some insight into what kinds of questions are unknown that your thesis might present to your reader, and that will help you tailor your argumentation.